Our next speaker, first speaker after lunch, joining us all the way from Washington State University is Andrew McGuire. Andrew is the cropping systems agronomist with Washington State. He works with farmers to implement solutions to integrated farming challenges in the Columbia Basin of Washington State. His current efforts focus on developing systems that build soils through high residue farming and cover cropping. He thinks and then writes about agriculture at WSU and on his Twitter, which is at Agronomist Ag. And I know I follow a lot of what Andrew's talking about either on his Twitter page as well as on his blog. And I'm always finding new and interesting items that you have to share, and really appreciate the sensible approach that you take to looking at this information, which is hence the title of your talk today on sensible soil health. So thank you very much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Marla. Get set up here. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Whoops, I still can't see part of my screen here. Just a second. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I remember well the last time I was in Manitoba. It was late January of 2019. I took a late flight from Calgary to Brandon to speak at the potato conference there. And on the flight, I read a short story. I just happened to bring it with me. It's called To Build a Fire by Jack London. It's about a guy in the wilds of Yukon in winter trying to start a fire. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I recommend reading it in a very warm room. And that night at Brandon, it hit -40. And it was then that I learned that -40 is the same Celsius as it is Fahrenheit. You up there may be used to that, but that's the coldest I've ever been in. It's kind of a cold convergence of the temperature scales. I thought that was interesting. So anyway, I hear that it's much warmer than -40 in Manitoba these years, so that's good. Going back further than 2019, in 1999, when I moved to Washington State, to the job I have now, I drove by this sign. It's on Interstate 90 between Spokane and Seattle, just to the east of Moses Lake where my office is. And at the time, I thought it was an interesting fact, but after 20 years of working here, I've come to ask, how can poor soils produce high yields? Because this sign is talking about yields per acre, not total yield, potato yield for the county. And this is for Grant County. Because there's counties in Idaho that produce more total potatoes than we do here, but we produce the highest yields per acre. And as you can see, compared to the other states, we have very high potato yields. In contrast to the yields, the soils in the Columbia Basin are not healthy by many standards. This is the Haney soil test, but we've also used the Cornell soil health test. And that pin right there on the gauge is just above bad. So, and that's average of about 123 soils we collected a few years ago. So that means a lot of our soils are in that red zone. And if you read some of the studies, there's suggestions that the soil health threshold is about 3.4% organic matter. Most of our soils have less than 2% organic matter, and many of them have less than 1%. So how do we reconcile these two facts? The facts that by most standards, we have subpar soils, yet we have consistently higher yields than other areas. And I've written some on this topic, as you can see there at the bottom. And this is the basic question that has led me to what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. First, a little bit more about where I work. So you get here. This is the Columbia Basin of central Washington State. This is Interstate 90 between Seattle over here and Spokane. And that sign that I showed you was right about where that pin is right there. The Columbia Basin of Washington is in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. So we only get about 6 to 8 inches of rain per year, and mainly in the winter. So it's kind of a Mediterranean climate, but it's very dry. This is what our native vegetation looks like. It's the shrub steppe of the Intermountain West. When the Lewis and Clark party came through here and described the region, one of them said it was 1,000 shades of brown. I like that description. But with irrigation, it turns green. We have irrigation from Lake Roosevelt on the Columbia River behind Grand Coulee Dam. All the water comes from the Canadian snowfields up in British Columbia, and it enables us to grow all sorts of crops, including the baby greens seen here. We've seen a lot of production move up from California with their drought problems. We also grow a lot of tree fruit, apples, of course, berries, mint, hay, onions, potatoes, wheat, corn, dry beans. So how can we do this? And these are all very productive crops. How can we do this? And here we're getting a little bit closer to an answer to my question. So there's a hierarchy of factors that affect crop yield. And at the top is weather/climate, which is basically the temperature during the growing season. And the next one down is water and so on. So with irrigation, we control when and how much water a crop gets. And soil health will affect these top two factors, your water and your nutrient management to a lesser extent. But with irrigation, we've removed that water factor and we've greatly reduced the nutrient management factor because we can use fertigation to kind of spoon feed our crops. What this means is that effectively we've reduced the importance of soil health in irrigated production. Did you hear that? I said we would reduce the importance of soil health in irrigated production. I know it's kind of heretical to say that. What I'm saying is that we get high yields with poor soils because we have a good climate. So that's the temperature during this season. And we have irrigation and fertigation. So don't get me wrong, water is very important in dryland and rain-fed farming. In those regions, soil health can help with infiltration, with water storage and use. And in regions without irrigation, those gains in water translate directly to yield increases, or even additional crops if fallow was the norm. So water is by far the largest benefit of soil health in some locations, but with irrigation, we take the water out of the picture mostly. Here's some more evidence of this from other parts of the country. This is soybean yields over here, graphed against an index of climate and soil productivity. So what about this group of soybeans up here? How did they overcome the climate and soil limitations? Those were irrigated soybeans. So irrigation overcomes to a large extent climate and soil limitations. One more piece of evidence on this in this review on the relationship between soil physical properties and crop production. Leite says this, because management and weather are integral factors, there's no meaningful correlation between texture, bulk density, structure, and crop productivity. So if you look at bulk density and structure as soil health, there's no relationship between crop yield and soil health. Why? Because of the water and the weather factors. What about other problems with poor soil health? Because irrigation doesn't negate all the effects of poor soil health. So again, how do we produce high yields? It comes back to this, to management. And I'm going to talk about this most of the rest of the time, this management factor. So farmers manage problems, and sometimes they do it with tillage. But getting back to it is they manage the problems. We can manage around many soil problems, and that's why we can have high yields from low quality soils. With an emphasis on improved soils, tillage becomes less of a desirable tool in many situations. But just because we don't use tillage, we still need to keep the mindset of managing the problem. So how can poor soils reduce high yields or produce high yields? With irrigation, which addresses the water factor, and with management. So I'm going to talk about the management factor some more. To manage, first of all, you have to identify your problems. You focus on identifying a specific problem and then fixing it with the tools you need. And I call this problem-based soil health evaluation. Here's kind of a flow chart for the whole process. This is an alternative to measurements, or perhaps in addition to some basic soil health measurements. And you can do this just by knowing your fields and their problems or their lack of problems. Your focus here is on managing the problem rather than going after this fuzzy idea of soil health. If you don't have any problems with your soil, you can probably safely assume that you have soil health. So I'm going to start with the most serious first, at least in the long term, and that is erosion. And it's often overlooked when it comes to soil health, but I put it at the very top. Our main challenge here is with wind erosion, and the wind preferentially takes away our best soil. It's taking away clay and organic matter particles. It's like those kids who, when they get a cupcake, they just eat the icing off that cupcake. The wind erosion is eating the frosting off our cupcake. Because those fine particles are very important in resisting wind erosion, the small difference that clay can make, or the small differences in clay, especially in our very sandy soils, it can make big differences in how sandy soils handle water. So this erosion is not just a thief of current soil health, it steals away future soil health too. Water erosion is very similar. It too steals the best of the surface soil. If it's minor, if you have major erosion, it's basically stealing the whole thing. And this is still a major problem after many decades of trying to fix it. So like the doctors have a motto, first do no harm, I think the farmer's motto must become first control erosion, because it really makes no sense to be worried about soil biology, about mycorrhizal fungi, about soil regeneration or the soil food web if your soil is leaving the farm. The good news here is that many of the practices that we use to minimize erosion also improve the soil. So we all know the practices that control erosion. There's the engineering ones, terraces, we got vegetative strips, prairie strips, and then we have no-till, strip till that leaves that mulch on the surface, perennial crops when they're economically feasible, cover crops. I'm not going to talk about all those solutions in detail, but give you some examples that you might not have seen before from our region, especially in terms of the specialty crops we grow. This is sweet corn, also grain corn that's strip tilled into alfalfa. We see this quite a bit, but it leaves that, it's a good rotation with perennial crops, annual crops, and leaves a lot of residue on the soil surface to protect against that wind erosion, which we often get in the spring when we don't have a large crop canopy. So strip till is becoming more and more popular in our region. We don't grow soybeans, but we grow a lot of dry edible beans, and these are direct seeded. They can either be direct seeded after a cover crop or strip tilled. What you're seeing here is direct seeded after first cutting of alfalfa or Timothy hay. We have a lot of alfalfa and Timothy hay, and the first cutting is always the most profitable because it's all going, at least the alfalfa is going as dairy hay. And so when the hay fields are coming out of production, you get one last cutting, that first cutting, you either spray it out after you get the hay up, or you let it grow a little bit, you plant and then spray. And the beans do very well. It controls wind erosion and reduces foliar disease, such as white mold. We have crops where tillage is required for harvest, like onions here or potatoes. We also do some carrots. And we can still make gains in soil health even in these types of crops where we have tillage, where it's really impossible to eliminate that tillage harvest. So this is a farmer developed strip tilled system of onions. Sandy soils that blow, the onion crop does not produce a very big canopy, and this prevents the sandblasting of the seedlings. Onion seed is very, very expensive. We're talking $1,000 an acre for just the seed sometimes. And this is a system that farmers have developed themselves using custom equipment and cover crops. If you want to see this in action, we've got videos on YouTube as well as a case study on this type of system for onions and for sweet corn. Potatoes is another crop I mentioned that requires tillage. And again, we have farmer developed systems using cover crops before planting during that period when we have high wind erosion potential in the spring. And you can see here, it's a sparse cover crop, but it does the job in keeping those hills formed as they would like them. Again, we've got a publication on this type of practice. You can see what happens if you don't use cover crops in these sandy soils. The whole potato hill can move, it can expose soils, it creates all kinds of problems for the rest of the season. So even tillage, if accompanied by a large enough amount of biomass, can increase soil organic matter and improve soil health. This is a mustard green manure crop that's used before potatoes in our region. We have around 25 to 30,000 acres of this going on in the fall. And we found that if growers can produce 2.5 dry tons per acre or more, they actually, and they use this not year after year, but every other year, every third year, we find that soil organic matter increases over time, even in a potato rotation in our soils. Disease suppression is the other main goal of this practice through that biofumigation mechanism. And even with the minimal amount of residue left, we find that we've done some research, we find that the threshold velocity where the wind begins to blow the soil was significantly increased by the green manures. So the soil resists wind erosion better, getting back to that first control erosion principle. So this next group of problems, they're often related to each other, and they're related to soil structure and structure stability. Here, the crusting is going to impede your seedling emergence, reduces water infiltration, leads to water runoff and erosion, poor air exchange, but we do have tools to manage these problems too. The first one I think of is to avoid compaction. And why avoid compaction? Because fixing compaction, at least serious compaction, requires tillage. Again, fixing that compaction, it requires moving the soil particles apart, restoring pore space, and that's going to require that physical action of tillage. Now, there are some products out there that claim to fix compaction by just spraying them, applying them to the soil. They don't explain exactly how a product is going to physically separate the particles to alleviate the compaction, to make that new pore space. And I think what actually happens with a lot of these products is they alleviate some of the effects of compaction, but not the compaction itself. It's like this marketing product. I think these products are kind of like these scrubbing bubbles. They're mainly wishful thinking, just like scrubbing requires actual physical force, which the bubbles cannot apply. So fixing serious deep compaction requires tillage, which these applied products cannot do. But it's better to avoid compaction in the first place. The next strategy to address that group of problems is to concentrate your soil organic matter at the surface in the top 1 to 3 inches. So you don't want to dilute your organic matter. You want to keep it there right where it does the most good, near the soil surface. And there's actually some papers out there how you can even use the ratio of organic matter at the surface to that in the lower layers as an indicator of soil health. If you do this, you get some of the benefit. You do get some benefits from deeper soil organic matter, but you get many more from concentrating them at the soil surface, as you can see here listed. And you don't have to actually, if you think about it, instead of diluting it over a large depth, by concentrating them at the soil surface, you don't actually have to change your total carbon in your soil or total organic matter in your soil. And you can still improve it just by moving that up, not tilling to get that to homogenize the soil organic matter. The other thing here is not to confuse building soil health with soil carbon sequestration. You don't have to sequester carbon to improve soils. If you can and you want to, do it, but it's not required to improve soils. If you have compost or manure available, again, concentrated at the soil surface, but this is a good way of importing converted sunlight from a large area and concentrating it to a small area. It also may be the most expensive way, but it's a great practice if it's available to you and affordable. Again, there are some products out there that claim to make it easy to increase soil organic matter at low rates, not tons. They're talking gallons, even quarts per acre or per hectare. Don't fall for that building soil organic matter without bulk materials. If you do the math, what you're adding is minimal compared to what's already there. You have to use bulk materials to change bulk soil properties. Once you get away from bulk materials, you're generally not building soil health. You may be doing something else, but you're not building soil health. Beware of bioproducts. Soil health is the goal that launched 1,000 products. I went to our Pacific Northwest Vegetable Conference trade show a few years ago. I collected all these names of these products: compost teas, biofertilizers, biostimulants, inoculants, all kinds of products. And I'm not saying anything regarding these specific products, but many were aimed at either changing or enhancing soil biology. And there's a major problem with that goal. First, you have organisms in the soil that are adapted to your soil's conditions. And that's like a lion on the plains of the Serengeti in Africa. And then you drop in these non-native organisms. It's kind of like this French poodle. It may sound good, but most likely the new organisms are going to become food for those organisms that are already there and are adapted to that habitat. What's better is to improve the habitat, give them more carbon food, better structure to the microbes that you already have, rather than try to add new ones. I just saw a paper actually yesterday comparing adding microbes to what was done in Jurassic Park, the movies. So even soil microbiologists are starting to question this idea of general inoculation of the soil. There are exceptions to this. So instead of thinking about broadcasting a variety of organisms across your soil, a better option with more potential is to apply not a diverse mix of microbes, but specific microbes, and not just to enhance soil biology, but to enhance seedling root growth of a specific crop. And not just broadcast across the bulk soil, but applied to the seed or in the furrow where it's going to do the most good. So just like we have the 4 R's of nutrient management, we should start to think of the 4 R's of microbial products. So you have to have the right material, the right mechanism, the right place at the right time. Okay, back to our flow chart. Managing the problem. The next problem is partially related to soil health. We want our crops to recover as much of the applied nutrients as possible. And I mentioned the 4 R's of nutrient management, but beyond that, what can we do? Well, concentrating soil organic matter at the surface will help for all those reasons I talked about before, but providing a mulch cover of crop residues will also help, because the crop roots will then grow up to the soil surface and they'll better intercept and take up broadcast nutrients. We've seen this in our region, even with irrigation. So in arid climate irrigated systems, like the ones I work in, if you control the water, you control where the nutrients go. So again, soil health is less of a factor. And in other regions, there's the usual practices: perennial crops, when feasible, because of their deep roots, they're able to intercept a lot of those nutrients before they leave the system. Cover crops in the winter time, when you don't have cash crops. An even better idea than cover crops, and this is what a lot of our growers do, is fill up the whole time with cash crops. So they intersperse spring planted crops with fall planted crops, and then you have cash crops going all year. So keeping something growing as much of the time as possible, either cover crops or cash crops. Cover crops don't mean just cereal rye. This is an overwintered arugula crop just before termination in our area. Arugula is usually a leafy green. You've probably eaten it in salads. Sometimes it's on pizzas. In our region, it's used with mustard for nematode control before potatoes. but it's also used by itself as an overwintering cover crop because the mustard will not overwinter, but the arugula, if it's planted at the right time, will. So strategic crop sequencing, adding diversity to your rotations through cover crops and getting out of the normal cover crops that we see. So speaking of cover crops, ecological theory predicts that there's advantages to diverse mixtures of crops. Does this hold true for annual crops in agriculture? You've probably heard the practice being promoted with slogans like farm like nature, mimic nature in our farming. And what these slogans actually boil down to is increasing the diversity of plant species. So there's this diversity productivity thinking that there's these synergistic effects between the species and they complement each other rather than compete. And that's going to lead to greater biomass production, provision of what they call ecosystem services. So what does the research say? Earlier this year, myself and another author, we reviewed all the research we could find on cover crop mixtures that had at least 3 species in them. And in each species, we compared the best monoculture to the best mixture, and this is what we found. For 7 different benefits of cover crops, overall, monocultures performed significantly better in 10% of the comparisons. Mixtures performed significantly better in only 2% of the comparisons. In the remaining 88% of the comparisons between the best monoculture and the best mixture, they were comparable. So there is no distinct advantage with these annual crops of growing a cover crop mixture. The lone exception is mixing a legume with a cover crop or a legume with a grass in low nitrogen soils. And usually if you're mixing 2 species in those types of mixtures, that's enough. So I can't cover all the problems today, but I hope you get the idea. You identify the problem, then you use management and all the available tools to fix the problem. If you end up here on the flow chart, you probably have healthy soil. You keep doing what you're doing, you measure progress, have your problems lessened, you monitor soil organic matter storage and breakdown. So your total soil organic matter, maybe throw in soil respiration in there, Solvita test, that kind of thing. Monitor it over time, and you don't have to worry too much. If you're over here on the other side and you have some of these problems, again, identify the problem, eliminate the causes, and manage the problem with those tools you have. In looking at the tools we have, I think they can be summarized using these 2 principles, maximize and minimize. I actually have a full talk on these 2 principles that I gave for the Huron in Ontario, the Soil and Crop Improvement Association, and they're going to post it. I gave it just 2 days ago. They're going to post it online. So if you want to see more on this. So it basically gives you just 2 dials to adjust within your cropping system. And this is all subject to climate, to market, economic and management constraints, that all those factor into farm decisions. So it's not like you have to maximize photosynthesis and minimize tillage. You have to do that within your system to optimize it overall. So you have 2 principles. There's many practices that are listed up here. It leaves lots of room for creativity, innovation, and fit for individual farms. So there's practices that accomplish these principles at the top. And then there's practices that facilitate these principles, like livestock grazing, listed at the bottom there. I'm going to leave you with this. Remember that soils with poor soil health can still provide high yields, and that's through management. A problem that will help you avoid some of the less productive distractions of soil health is that flow chart I gave you. Use all the tools available to manage that problem, manage the problems that you identify, and then keep in mind these 2 principles: maximize photosynthesis and minimize tillage. And with that, here's my contact information where I post my blogs, and I can answer some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. This was Very, yes, big round of applause from the people you can see on the screen right now. That was really good, and it drives home a lot of the really basic points around soil health, because I often in my day job deal with those same questions regarding, the fancy products that can be used to minimize compaction or salinity and things like that, that aren't necessarily taking into account the broader concept of why those things happen, what's causing them to happen. And so, it just becomes a bit of a band-aid, but it's not actually fixing anything. We have one question so far that's come into the chat, and I just remind people to post your questions into the Q&A box. How would I convince a grower to take the first step towards building soil health? The common feedback from their growers here is, I have to till the land or it gets hard as concrete. So how do I make the first step towards, making those changes?
Well, they've identified the problem there. It gets hard as concrete. And then you have to say, well, why does it get as hard as concrete? It may be that it probably has no structure. And so why does it have no structure? It may be it doesn't have, you got to look at how much organic matter is coming into the system versus how much is leaving it. And then allowing the soil biology to build that structure. So are you tilling it often? I guess that would be the questions I would pose to them.
Yeah, there's a comment that came in, no till, no crop, which is, yeah, he's perfectly timed his barking at the people walking past the house. It's just how it rolls around here. No till, no crop is the comment that came in. I don't know if that's meant to be a comment or just like a comment from the agronomist here, or a comment from the growers. But that becomes an often a large discussion for our growers in, say, the Red River Valley, where we are in Winnipeg, where we have heavier clay soils, and there's a lot of hesitancy towards the movement to no-till or even reduced till in any way. A lot of people are doing some towards reduced till. Do you have, and I haven't asked you this question before, but do you have things like vertical tillage equipment and high-speed shallow discs being used in your area?
We do. We have some vertical tillage being used mainly to address shallow compaction. For instance, in our hay fields, often growers, they try to avoid it, but often they go out, and put up the hay, especially in the earlier spring, the first cutting. They'll put it up when the soil's too wet, and they'll get, generally it's not very deep because you have lots of alfalfa roots in the deeper layers, but it's shallow compaction. So they use some vertical tillage to take care of that. And it doesn't kill the alfalfa. And if you set up the implement right.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it's probably more true vertical tillage with a straight kind of coulter style, as opposed to the high speed.
Yeah, trying to remember the name of the implement. Turbo till. We use a lot of turbo tillers.
Yeah.
Great Plains, I think.
Great, yeah, and that's usually a bit more on the lighter side in terms of disturbance. Another question came in, is there a logical way to plan a field trial if you were going to validate the microbial inoculants, or invalidate, in this case, this person has said?
Oh, definitely. Unfortunately, if you want to do it the right way, it's not easy. But there's way to do field strips and farms, and there's lots of extension, probably in Canada too, but there's lots of US extension publications on how to put in a field strip trial with replications. And, in using inoculants, that wouldn't really be that hard to do.
Yeah, and I would also direct people here to also talk to somebody like John Hurd, who has done a lot with field trials, as well to the different growers associations. So, canola growers, MPSG, or Manitoba Pulse and Soybean growers, also have people who are doing on-farm trials and specializing in that. So those are always places locally that people can go for those types of that kind of assistance. Is anyone? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
On that topic, though, inoculants have been around for a long time. I worked in Nebraska back in the early 90s, and Practical Farmers of Iowa is a farmer group that tested a lot of these. They have a report, I think it's still online, where they actually did these replicated strip trials on lots of different farms, and almost all of the products either had no effect or the effect was not great enough to cover the cost. So the story is basically the same, although some of the big companies are getting into that, and those may be more tested and more reliable, hopefully.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we're always looking for is more of that testing to be done, because we don't necessarily have a lot of third-party or university testing done on these products. So it really comes down to the farmer and the agronomist to have to figure that out for themselves, which is unfortunate. Is anyone in your region using controlled traffic farming and as a way to manage compaction?
Nobody that I know of is. The problem in our region is that land changes hands back and forth. So potato growers often lease land from hay growers for just that 1 year of potato growth, and then they go back. And so because of the complexity of our rotations, which we really don't have rotations, I call them dynamic crop sequences, because nobody stays in a cycle. They're just based on market and on all the crops that we can grow. It's constantly changing. And so the machinery is not standardized across all these different specialty crops. And so therefore we don't use that.
Another question came in, and I'm hoping that I'm going to get this right because it's kind of a two-part typed scenario here, or statement. Are growers sustaining a 2-year rotation with the mustard green manure in the rotation with potato?
Yes, there are some that are doing that. And actually that's when I went to Brandon in 2019 for their potato conference. That's what I was speaking about. Growers are using a potato, wheat, mustard after the wheat rotation and staying in that 2-year rotation and finding actually that it's kind of counterintuitive, because with potatoes, we generally think the longer the rotation, the better. But when we add this green manure, and you increase the frequency of the green manure, which you do in a 2-year rotation, you actually get improving soils over time and improved potato yields, or at least potato yields that are maintained even in a short rotation with no no increased disease or pest pressure. However, I should say, however, we grow lots of processed potatoes, and the processors in their contracts don't usually allow that. In their contracts, they'll say at least 3 years out, 2 or 3 years out for potatoes.
And
so
I don't know.
There's a risk there.
Yeah. I don't know with potatoes here what the what's there in terms of contracts too, but I'm sure the exact same thing would be happening at our end. And a lot of times the contract's going to stipulate what you can and cannot do with regards to some of these different practices. So I'm not seeing other questions come in unless John Hurd wants to ask one live, which means you have to unmute yourself, John Hurd. I'll give you the chance.
I'm sorry, I can't get into the question to type it in, so I'll ask you direct, Andrew. Why has it been so hard for soil health researchers to quantify benefits? And why do they become inspirational speakers instead of researchers?
Wow. There's a loaded question there. The first one is why is it so difficult to measure the benefits of soil health? I think you're talking about there in terms of the soil biology. It's very difficult to measure the benefits. In fact, there's again, just a paper that came out a few days ago that looks at all the microbiological metrics that we're using and basically critiques them all and says, you know, these haven't shown us, there's so many caveats and it's difficult to interpret those measurements. And they give some fairly good suggestions, I think, for improving that. The other thing I think, in terms of crop yield, I think it's all about the water, as I mentioned before. If you can increase either the amount of water, and it depends where you are. If you're in an area that gets more water than you need for a crop, it's not going to translate to, soil health is not going to translate to increased yields generally. You know, that's why the central plains of the US, the drier area, is going to have much more benefit from soil health than either irrigated areas or the humid east. because that translates directly, if they can store more water, if they can get more water in the soil, translates directly to crop yield. So I think we need to stop thinking about soil health as the same in all the different regions, because it's definitely different. In our region, growers really look at it as, in terms of soil-borne disease and pests. So nematodes and fungal diseases. That's where their real focus is in terms of soil health. And that's because of the system we're in. So it's going to be different in different systems.
Yeah,
Your second question. I'm sorry, you were muted.
No, that's okay. It's fine. I forgot that you have a lot to answer for you.
The second question is, I think there's a rock star kind of almost a celebrity culture out there in terms of people that speak on soil health and why they go off, and they go off from research and don't look back, because they become rock stars in the eyes of a lot of people. And so there's a celebrity draw there. That's my short answer.
That is a very brilliant short answer to that very difficult, long type question. Other questions are popping up. Are there any short or long-term concerns about water supply to maintain the current farming practices in your area? No,
because of the Great Canadian ice fields that the Columbia Basin or the Columbia River is based on. There's been a lot of studies in terms of climate change and what's happening. And basically those ice fields that the Columbia River comes from and produces most of their flow are very stable. So we are, and the other thing is, excuse me, the other thing is because the Columbia River is such a big river, our irrigation system takes less than 3% or right around 3% of the flow off. So it's not a big chunk of that flow. So even with climate change, they think that the timing of the peak flows will change. The total amount's going to be around the same, but the timing of the flows will change. But because it's behind a Grand Coulee Dam and Lake Roosevelt, that's not going to hurt the irrigation system. So people like Bill Gates, I don't want to start a land drive here to buy our farming land, but people like Bill Gates are buying land in our region for just this reason. It's a very sustainable irrigated system and does not have some of the problems that they have in California with regard to drought because of where the water comes from. Thank you, Canada. And actually the Canada and the United States are in negotiations for the treaty right now. It's been going on for several years.
Well, and on that note, I will actually ask, I don't know if you're sticking around a little bit. There are a couple open questions still in the Q&A that you may want to look at. But with that, I would like to thank you for joining us all the way up north here in Manitoba and not having to actually physically come here, which I know is quite delightful for a lot of people who otherwise would have a fair bit to travel to come. So next time, hopefully we meet you in person, but thank you very much for being with us virtually here today.